Acha ji, so the second expenditure switching policy, again let me remind you, expenditure switching, you are trying to influence the export import price so that you want people to switch towards local Pakistani products so that your trade deficits are resolved. Now usme after exchange rate, the second main expenditure switching policy is tariff. Now, tariff is just a fancy word that we use, but basically what it means is when you put a tax on some imported product. Now, what it does in terms of being an expenditure switching policy is that obviously if you put a tax on any imported product, then the price of that import will increase, and therefore your people will be discouraged from buying those imports. Imports come hogi, your trade deficit will resolve, your people will switch towards local products, and therefore you can hopefully correct your trade deficits and therefore your current account deficits. So in principle, the idea of how a tariff behaves as an expenditure switching policy, the basic principle is really simple. आप imports महंगी कर रहे हो and you're trying to discourage people from buying those imports. Now, as far as your essay questions are concerned, वहाँ पे if you get an 8 or a 12 mark question as to, is this an effective policy, or how does tariff, or, tariff का नाम ना भी लिया जाए, if you are given a question of where you have to explain a couple of expenditure switching policies, usme first give this simple basic logic that this is how tariffs try to control the amount of imports, but uske baad you will have to give the graph of tariff, which we recently did in the class. Usme yaad rakho, we said that if you have any product and if you have the local market of that product, and in that local market if the price is P star and Q star, and then you open this products market for international trade, and we said that if we assume that the international world price PW, the world price, that would mean that is price pay, world price pay, you can supply as many products in this country as possible. So this is where I told you that once you open to international trade, then what happens is that this price PW is the one that becomes effective in your country, and at this price the quantity supplied is much less than the quantity demanded. So this excess amount is basically the import, the amount of import. So that is theoretically how we depict the amount of import of a certain product. And here we said that if you put a tariff on this product, then let's say the amount of or let's just call that tariff T, then the price, world price, will increase. It will go vertically up by the amount of tariff, and therefore the local supply will increase, the local demand will decrease, and therefore the amounts of imports will fall. So this is how you will explain through this graph the working of tariff and how tariffs, they help reduce the amount of imports and therefore correct the country's trade deficit. So again, this is very theoretical explanation. Principle, as I said, is simple. आप उस product को महंगा कर रहे हो and therefore the amount of imports are going to decrease. And then what you really need to understand is again an analysis of, is this policy of tariff, is it effective? Does it work? And secondly, the same question, whether this is a desirable policy or not. Now, as far as effectiveness is concerned, again, remember the easy point is then the amount of tariff matters. Amount of tariff matters. So, if you put a duty of, let's say, just 2,000 rupees on imported cars, which overall costs you millions of rupees, so this is a negligible amount of tariff. It won't be enough to discourage enough people from stop buying these imports. Whereas if you put a let's say a tariff of 0.5 million rupees, then this is a significant amount of tariff, and therefore more and more people will be discouraged, and therefore your imports will decrease more significantly. So whether your tariff as a policy to control your trade deficit is effective or not, that depends first of all on the amount of tariff. Then it also depends on whether the import demand is elastic or inelastic. Now, if your import demand is inelastic, it means that your country's government, it's putting a tax and making a import more expensive. But inelastic demand means that you will still keep on buying whatever quantity you used to buy. I shouldn't say whatever quantity. Inelastic demand means कोई significant फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा quantity में. So if anything, if your product's demand is inelastic and you try to make it more expensive by putting a tariff, the quantity won't fall as much, and therefore you will in fact start spending more dollars on buying that product. So inelastic demand ho to tariff doesn't work. You want the demand of the product being taxed, that is being put under a tariff, to be elastic, so that as soon as it becomes expensive, your local people stop buying it, and therefore the amount of dollars that are going out on that product, they fall, and your trade deficit improves. So that is the second condition that you need. And then again, there is this question of retaliation, which is a big serious issue. Now, retaliation I have mentioned it a couple of times in the class as well. I have mentioned this trade war that recently took place between China and USA. और उसमें ये ट्रेड वॉर सारी शुरू इस तरह से हुई थी कि अमेरिकन्स दे पुट अ टैरिफ ऑन सम ऑफ चाइनीज products, and then Chinese, they started putting tariffs on American products. And if this retaliation starts, तुम टैरिफ लगाते हो, अगला कंट्री जो है रिटेलिएटरी टैरिफ लगाता है. सो व्हाट हैपन्स इज दैट इंस्टेड ऑफ इम्प्रूविंग योर ट्रेड बैलेंस, ओवरऑल ट्रेड स्टार्ट्स श्रिंकिंग. Both import and export start shrinking, and that in itself has obviously very bad consequences for both the economies. So those are the few points that you can raise in effectiveness. And then as far as desirability of this policy of tariffs is concerned, desirability say again the meaning is that what is the impact on consumers and producers and the government. Usme yaad rakho, for the government it's not such a bad policy, because the government will earn revenue because of these tariffs. So in a way, the government enjoys these tariffs. It's a source of revenue. As far as the local producers are concerned, you are giving domestic protection to your domestic industry. So the producers, they are also happy. The government is trying to do things that switch people's expenditures towards local products, so the producers will also be happy. But you can say consumers, or you can say overall, again the big issue is that you are putting tariffs on imported products. So ये imported चीज़ें महंगी होंगी, and that can again lead to cost push inflation. So if you think about both these expenditure switching policies, exchange rate and tariffs, they work in slightly different ways, but in principle they are trying to do the same thing. They are trying to play around with export-import prices. Difference between exchange rate and tariff is that exchange rate, it affects both the export and the import price. It tries to switch the expenditures both from exports and imports. Whereas tariffs, they only target import prices, and therefore they only try to switch the import expenditures towards local products. That is one big difference between these two expenditure switching policies. And one practical difference which you should focus upon if you are asked, अच्छा tariff or exchange rate में से which one is a better expenditure switching policy, then one good way of thinking about that comparison is कि देखो, when you depreciate your exchange rate, then you are basically ending up making all of your imports more expensive. You can't distinguish कि अच्छा मैं luxury products को तो महंगा कर लेता हूँ, imported luxury products को, which are sort of useless things, but maybe I don't want to increase the price of imported fuel. But if you are depreciating your exchange rate, then you cannot pick and choose which import will become expensive and which will not. You depreciate your exchange rate, every import, including the imported raw materials and petrol, all the things become expensive. But the thing with tariff is that you can be more targeted, because you can pick and choose that which are the products on which I am going to impose a tariff, and therefore which are the imports that I am going to make more expensive, and therefore which are the imports that I am going to try and discourage people from buying. So अगर आपने tariff लगाना होता है तो you don't put these tariffs on imported petrol. You won't put these tariffs on imported energy. You won't put these tariffs on imported machinery and raw materials. Instead, you try to pick and choose and target sort of unnecessary luxury products such as cosmetics and chocolates and video games and things like that. So tariffs sort of, you can say, win over exchange rate depreciation as an expenditure switching policy, just because you can better target and better focus this policy. Now there can be other ways in which you can compare these policies, but I mean one solid big reason is enough. तो जब भी तुम्हें ये question आए where you have to compare exchange rate versus tariff as an expenditure switching policy, just elaborate upon this thing. With tariff you can target कि कौन सी import महंगी हो रही है. With exchange rate depreciation it's like a blanket policy, सारी की सारी imports महंगी. So cost push inflation therefore becomes a more serious problem. कोई question tariff पे? Anybody?
सर कंपैरिजन में हम ये भी लिख सकते हैं ना कि जो हमारा एक्सचेंज रेट डिप्रिसिएशन है, सर एक्सचेंज रेट डिप्रिसिएशन में हम यानी वो तो एक्सपोर्ट्स पे भी करेगा ना कि उससे तो एक्सपोर्ट्स पे ज्यादा होंगे.
बिल्कुल. So you can say you are throwing a wider net. You are attacking exports as well as imports and all the export and all the imports, which is in the one way a good thing. कि आप अपने ट्रेड डेफिसिट की प्रॉब्लम को यू आर सॉर्ट ऑफ अटैकिंग इट फ्रॉम ऑल द एंगल्स. बट वी आर सेइंग कि उसमें फिर प्रॉब्लम ये होता है कि यू एंड अप इंक्रीजिंग द प्राइस ऑफ ऑल द इम्पोर्ट्स, जिससे फिर कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन भी होती है. वेयर एज जो टैरिफ्स हैं उसमें यू कैन टारगेट, ठीक है आप एक्सपोर्ट्स को नहीं छेड़े, बट एज फार एज इम्पोर्ट्स को तुम एडजस्ट करना चाह रहे हो, यू कैन टारगेट कि विच इम्पोर्ट्स टू डिस्करेज एंड विच इम्पोर्ट्स टू लीव अलोन. पूछ लो और फिर से पूछ लो क्वेश्चन. आई थिंक आई डिडंट रियली लिसन टू योर क्वेश्चन एक्चुअली. मुझे बताओ फिर से एनीथिंग दैट इज कमिंग टू योर माइंड, यू कैन आस्क मी.
नहीं सर उस तरह से नहीं.